Welcome, everyone. As many of you will know, we recently published our latest policy prototyping report, and this edition focuses on the human oversight requirement as set out in Article 14 of the AI Act. And that's why we're hosting the webinar of today, to give you a quick overview of what policy prototyping involves, what's in the reports, and then what we will be working on next. But before we dive into that, let me briefly introduce the Knowledge Center Data and Society, which we are part of. Now, the center is a collaboration between 3 universities, and our mission is to explore the legal, ethical, and social aspects of data-driven and AI applications. And within this partnership, we at CITIB focus on the legal perspectives, while our colleagues at MICT and VUB contribute more on the social and ethical side of things. So who do we do all this for? Well, we try to be of service to 3 key groups: industry, policymakers, and civil society, and each of them faces their own challenges when it comes to AI and data. And we aim to support them in navigating those, of course. As for our mission, it's quite the list, but it all boils down to bridging knowledge and practice. We spread reliable information, support structural initiatives, and try to make sure societal and economic benefits don't get lost in all of the policy noise. Importantly, we don't do this in a vacuum. This work is part of a broader Flemish policy plan on AI, the Vlaamse Beleidsplan AI. Voilà. What's on the agenda for today? We'll first quickly dive into what policy prototyping for us is, the methodology that we use, the different prototypes that have been in the current project or report, and then the best practices and recommendations that we concluded out of the report. Lastly, a Q&A where all questions can be posed. So what is policy prototyping then? Let's zoom in a little bit. Now, in short, we treat policy making a bit like beta testing. So instead of waiting until everything is final, we test policy ideas while they're either still in draft form, like we did for the transparency requirement last time, or implementation is due soon, like the human oversight requirements. So we test them out in the real world with real people, so real AI providers and deployers, and also real AI systems, or at least their prototypes. We then create compliance documents, which can be considered to be a first start on the road to being compliant with the AI Act. We thus highlight one specific aspect, this time the human oversight, last time transparency, on which we zoom in and we really try to consider how the AI systems in question can be made compliant. So what the compliance documents would look like, etc. Then we map the results. So what works, what doesn't work, where are the blind spots? And this then helps us understand both the strengths and the limitations of both the proposed rules and the compliance documents that we drafted in the first phase. Now, the goal is to move from policy to something that can actually be implemented with fewer surprises, better outcomes when the time is actually there to implement the requirements themselves. Voilà, just a quick note about on how we approached the methodology. So we kicked things off in March 2024 with the prototyping phase. And the topic human oversight was chosen from a short list shaped by both our internal priorities and input from stakeholders. After that, we launched a public call to gather participants. It was then in September 2024 that we moved into the testing phase. This took the form of a free workshop where we applied a legal design methodology to put the prototypes to the test. And we worked with 14 participants and 4 facilitators, which gave us a great mix of perspectives and kept the setting manageable. Now, voilà. After the testing phase, we moved then into the feedback phase in October 2024. So we had 2 main groups of participants, the participants who partook in the physical workshop in the testing phase, and then the reviewees who really were responsible for reviewing the compliance documents that were created in the first phase and get feedback on that. We launched a second call for participation for this. Voilà. We launched the second call for participation for those second group of participants, for the reviewees. And then we conducted one-on-one interviews with these people, 11 in total, to kind of dig a little deeper into what worked, what didn't work, what could be improved in these documents. And from there, we shifted towards implementation, which is the last phase. This includes the writing and the publishing, of course, of the policy prototyping report, which pulls everything together, from design choices to lessons learned. The report is all of the feedback of reviewees boiled down, common threads found, best practices identified and highlighted. So by reading the report and its annex, you will really read the work of all of the participants involved, which we've structured, hopefully in a useful way, in order to start with AI Act compliance. The compliance documents are also attached as examples. Now, all of this work was grounded in real use cases brought in by our own participants. So we worked with 3 concrete use cases. The first one was an education application designed to give students feedback. The second one was a case involving cardiovascular imaging in healthcare. And third, a use case focused on big data policing, looking at predictive tools in law enforcement. The workshop participants used these 3 cases to draft practical compliance documents aimed at implementing Article 14 of the AI Act. And the documents are also included in the annex of the report. So if you're looking for concrete illustrations or templates to build on, that's the place to look, or otherwise scan our beautiful QR code and it will lead you there as well. And then I'll give the floor to my colleague. Voila. You're still muted, Wannes.
Wonderful. Some minor technical hiccups, of course. Thank you, Lotte, for explaining the methodology and also for introducing these prototypes. Now, of course, discussing all of these 3 different prototypes in detail would take us a bit too far during this webinar, as we're discussing each individual piece of feedback. So as in the report, we'll focus on the gathered best practices for making these compliance documents related to human oversight measures, and also some policy recommendations that we derived from the feedback to Article 14 of the AI Act. So if you are a provider of a high-risk AI system and you're starting to draft your human oversight measures and the documents in which you'll explain those measures to your deployers, what should you be wary of? What should you keep in mind? Well, one chief thing that returned during our feedback phase was the importance of detailing the governance of the oversight at the deployer, meaning that you as a provider, knowing what's going on at your deployer, for example, if you're making an AI system for a school, knowing how a school is structured, the different roles that you find in that type of organization, can determine those specific roles already in your human oversight measures, assign responsibilities and actions to each of them in a way that's manageable for the deployer to then implement. So again, taking the example of a school, you might say, well, our teachers, or rather your teachers, they will be busy with the day-to-day oversight of the AI system, individual students, individual feedback that AI is giving students. But on a more managerial level, that's where you will find the roles that determine the criteria that AI system uses, that determine when the AI system is used in the school. And by detailing that governance structure, you already give, as a provider, deployers a good perspective on how they can arrange the oversight in a way that minimizes the risk of the AI system. Speaking about risk, of course, describing the risk that the AI system could pose and that you as a provider identify, that's very prevalent in the system, as well as the user profiles. So the profiles of the people who should be doing the human oversight is very helpful for the deployer. That includes, of course, describing the intended purpose and the use of the AI system, but also the various risks. If you take a look at the right-hand side of this slide, for example, we see a section of the second prototype, where they said not only is our user profile a cardiologist or someone with extensive experience in cardiovascular imaging, but we also identify the main risk, given the sector, to be automation bias. Providing information such as this in your compliance documents really sets up your developer, or rather your deployer, to know exactly what the risks are and why you are making specific, or why you're enabling certain human oversight measures to address those risks. In terms of the form that your human oversight measures take, having integrated measures, technical measures in the AI system is far more preferable than having organizational measures that you set out for the deployer. making sure that the system itself has certain nudges, reminders, checks, or prompts that prompt the person overseeing it to perhaps overturn a decision or have a moment and think about what decision of the AI system actually is vastly preferable than setting up broad organizational strokes for deployers to follow. So that if you can implement human oversight measures into the working of the AI system or the process around, perhaps in the machinery that it's using, then that is preferable. Some best practices then regarding specific human oversight measures. There we found, for example, that the AI Act suggests that you have some measures around automation bias and how to avoid it. We found that also there you should make sure not to overwhelm your users, both in the information that the AI system itself provides, as well as in the human oversight measures. You don't, of course, want your human oversight measures to be the one thing that then leads to another form of automation bias. Having a second tier of oversight, for example, having a second overseer, a second teacher looking at the evaluation given to the students or to the advice given to students, or a second doctor looking at imaging, for example, really augments this measure and helps to prevent automation bias. When it comes to training users as human oversight measure, of course, that training should be focused on the goals of those specific users and not just be a general catch-all training. It should provide concrete examples to the users, to the people overseeing the human oversight, and to make sure that they know in specific situations what exactly specifically they should be doing. And we also found during the feedback process that that training measure should always be complemented with other measures. It's not a silver bullet where you can just do the training and then, of course, comply with the AI Act. You should make sure that you have other measures in place, other risk mitigations, things to avoid automation bias. For example, maybe a stop button and so on. Talking about this stop button then, this was a bit less relevant for our use cases since most of our AI systems were individual instances rather than, let's say, a large process as you might have in a conveyor belt or in a factory. But still, we found during the feedback phase that several reviewees gave the suggestion that you have an organization-wide stop button, certain criteria that you determine for when the AI system isn't suited to be used anymore, and when you should take the human oversight measure of stopping the AI system, at least temporarily within your organization. So that can also be a very useful human oversight measure to include or to set parameters for as a provider. Now, as to the form of your documents and certain best practices on the documents themselves, of course, having your documents tailored to your audience is a major benefit in terms of understandability for your deployer and for other readers. Your language of the document should, of course, be aimed at the user, having technical terms when your users are technically very strong. If they adapt at AI systems, you can go a bit more into the different technical specifications. But if they aren't, if they, let's say, teachers, doctors, police officers with sector-specific knowledge, but not with knowledge in AI systems, of course, having layman's terms is preferable. Giving specific user instructions also received very positive feedback. Our first prototype on education using AI systems really had the form of an instruction manual, or at least aimed to have that form, and there we noticed there was overwhelmingly positive feedback for the specificity that those documents provide. Visual elements are of course always a plus and help to make your documents more understandable. Similarly, balancing the amount with the detail of information leads to better documents. If you are dealing with technical profiles, more information, more technical information might help them understand it. But again, if you're dealing with lay people, we often find that those people are not well served by having too much information, but they just need the right kind of information. Complementing that, there is a certain amount of information or a certain type of information that's useful in all cases. Having background on the AI system, what it's intended to do, what your idea as a provider is that the AI system will do, as well as having some basic information on the performance of the AI system, was in all cases received with good feedback. Additionally, of course, having a good structure and flow to your human oversight measures to the documents describing them is a significant added value. Going from general to specific and having a clear table of contents really improved the quality of these documents. And the exemplary student in this class was actually the first policy prototype that was drafted, where we really received a lot of good, valuable feedback that this prototype's structure was as it should be. So if you're interested in that, you can of course check it out in the annex to the policy prototyping project. If you want more detailed feedback on the specific prototypes, you can really go through them line by line or section by section. I recommend that you have a look at the project report itself. Now, of course, as I also mentioned, we gathered some feedback on the policy itself as well, meaning specifically around the formulation of Article 14 of the AI Act. We asked reviewers to review 4 different aspects of that article: its practicability, so can it at all be put into practice? Its feasibility, do you need a lot of resources to put it into practice? Its desirability, right? Is it useful, valuable to put it into practice, to have this obligation at all? And its understandability. How well can the requirements be understood by the audience? You can see, of course, that practicability, feasibility, and understandability all have some type of overlap, but they will, of course, influence each other. And he received, unfortunately for Article 14 of the AI Act, some harsher feedback or some very pointed feedback where we noticed that in terms of practicability and feasibility, the article is still quite unclear and quite broad. It doesn't indicate a minimum level. It's very difficult for providers to find a minimum level where they comply with the AI Act to know exactly what type of human oversight measures they should implement. And several terms are excessively vague within the formulation of Article 14. Think, for example, the words levels of autonomy, reasonably foreseeable misuses, commensurate with certain risks of the AI system. All of that leads to legal uncertainty at the providers and, in turn, also to the deployers, where they themselves don't know if the measures suggested by a provider are sufficient. In terms of feasibility, reviewees also noted a lack of expertise at the user. For example, a teacher, a medical professional, or a police officer might not have the AI knowledge that's needed necessarily to hold the human oversight, leading to some resource issues. And in general, both providers as well as deployers could have issues of time, budget, and awareness. Awareness there referring to being aware of their obligations under the AI Act, but also of the importance of complying with them. So there, the question is, of course, how we'll address those specific difficulties. Now, in positive news, in terms of desirability, the article was found to be very desirable. So having human oversight obligations was considered by the reviewers to be an added value to increase support not only for the AI system, but also the use of the AI system, and to make sure that affected persons and deployers can confidently use and trust the system. So while there are some difficulties in putting it into practice, we do also see that it is still considered a valuable thing to have this obligation. In terms of understandability, we then saw the reflection of, as I said earlier, this a bit unclear and broad provision where there is still difficulty translating the legal requirements to technical measures. Now, what can be done about this? There we, of course, also selected some recommendations, chief among them being concrete guidelines and examples issued by the AI Office or by other national authorities. Those guidelines should be both general as well as sector specific, establishing a sort of baseline, but then, of course, for certain sectors such as healthcare or law enforcement, it might be useful to give sector specific examples of how these human oversight requirements can be implemented. We shouldn't shy away from concrete examples here, allowing really there to be a sort of baseline to be set. And of course, there will be frequently reoccurring risks in AI systems that could be addressed in these guidelines. For example, automation bias is one that we often saw return in all 3 of our prototypes, and that could be addressed in those guidelines. In terms of technical measures, we of course still look forward to standards. Hopefully those will help us to some degree already turn these legal requirements into technical measures, as standards are currently being developed. So we'll see what that gives us when they do finally achieve publication. And having certain templates for human oversight measures could also, of course, help. Another suggestion made by reviewers was to set up some site or platform to exchange knowledge, to exchange best practices. You can think similar to how currently the AI Pact is gathering information on AI literacy. That could also be a good avenue for policymakers to pursue. And one final thing that was often found to be unclear and that could be clarified is the distribution of tasks of human oversight between the actors. Meaning currently, especially if you're dealing with organizational measures for human oversight, so these measures have to be determined by the provider, but then put into practice by the deployer, there we see that there's still a large gray zone in exactly who does what. At what point has the provider given enough information on how these organizational measures should look like? And at what point does the deployer need to start implementing them? There, this gray zone should hopefully still be a bit more clarified and the rules a bit more clearly delineated. There is, of course, some benefit to having flexibility in the legal requirements, making sure that they can be given sector-specific meaning and that they can be made specific to certain AI systems. But here we, of course, need to balance this with legal certainty and having a good notion of which technical details are needed for compliance. And finally, of course, you need multidisciplinarity to achieve compliance with these human oversight requirements. You need resources, both time, money, person power, and so on. And that, of course, creates also a need for SME-specific support from different authorities. That can take the form of those guidelines, but could also take the form of more concrete measures. And it's a final recommendation that was formulated in our report and that we hope to see from policymakers soon. So those were the main best practices for these compliance documents that are derived from our report, as well as some policy recommendations. I'll shortly open the door to questions. You can type them in the chat or you can raise your hand. We can certainly unmute you to ask a question in person. Before I do that, I'd still also like to point your attention to our next policy prototyping project, for which the call to participation is currently live on our website. You can find it behind this QR code, or you can navigate to our website, of course, and subscribe manually. In this new project, we will be examining the different requirements for contractual clauses between high-risk AI providers and their suppliers in Article 25.4 of the AI Act. So we hope to have there in the next year a workshop to determine how those contractual clauses could look like and hopefully also to derive some useful insights for you there. And then with that out of the way, Lotte and I will be happy to take some of your questions. And I think we already have one in chat. So are there guidelines from the EU available on this topic or other topics regarding the AI Act? For human oversight, currently, we do not have any guidelines already available, which is also part of why we held the exercise in this way. We do have guidelines already available on prohibited AI systems, as well as on the definition of AI systems. But of course, those aren't really related to these requirements at the moment. But thank you for your question in any case. Those can be, so the other guidelines addressing both of these questions can be found on the website of the AI office. Should also be noted that I think those still need to be finally approved and officially, let's say, sanctified by the EU Commission, but the draft is currently available and I'll make sure to post these in the chat after this webinar. In terms of whether human oversight can be delegated to ethics committees or something like this, of course, it's a possibility, but it should be still at the deployer. So for example, when it comes to human oversight and deployer's obligation, people handling this human oversight do need to have a certain amount of authority to reverse the results. And then the question is, of course, if this committee will have that authority. In my opinion, personally, it's probably better that employees do it or the users of the AI system. And yes, we do in our annex have the document available for the prototype around the cardiovascular imaging and the human oversight measures that our wonderful participants drafted for that AI system. You can find it, as Thomas just posted in the chat, in the annex document on our website. So be sure to check that out. All right, I'm not seeing more questions come in at the moment. Or maybe we do. All right, great. In any case, if you would have a question, but you're too hesitant to ask it, let's say in this webinar, you can find our contact information here. We, of course, always happy to talk to you about this interesting topic. And if you are interested in participating on these policy prototyping projects, of course, feel free to check out the call for participants that was also posted in the chat. And I think all that remains for me. So thank you for attending today. I hope these best practices and these policy recommendations were useful to you. I hope they can help you in all of your AI-related efforts. And we're, of course, more than happy if you want to reach out to us to discuss these findings. And if you know anyone who could benefit from this report, please feel free to share it with them.
you for attending, and with that, we'll end the meeting.